Fallacious.
Fallacious.
Such an argument is misleading, if not wholly fallacious.
Fallacy.
Fallacy.
It's a common fallacy that a neutered dog will become fat and lazy.
Fallback.
Fallback.
It's wise to have an extra video player as a fallback.
Do you have a fallback option?
Fallen.
Fallen. Fallen.
The road was blocked by a fallen tree.
Fallen leaves.
Fall guy.
Fall guy.
Brown claims that the company was simply looking for a fall guy. Brown claims that the company was simply looking for a fall guy. Fallible.
Fallible.
Humans are fallible.
These surveys are often a rather fallible guide to public opinion. These surveys are often a rather fallible guide to public opinion.
Falling out.
Falling out.
Falling star.
Falling star.
Fall off.
Fall off.
A fall-off in profits.
Fallopian tube.
Fallopian tube.
Fallout.
Fallout.
Protection against radioactive fallout.
The political fallout of the affair cost him his job.
Fallout shelter.
Fallout shelter.
Fallow.
Fallow.
They let the land lie fallow for a year.
The band went through a fallow period in the late 90s.
Fallow deer.
Fallow deer. False.
False.
Please decide whether the following statements are true or false. False accusations.
I don't want to give you any false hopes.
The statement gives us a false impression that we understand something when we do not. False assumptions about people of other cultures.
A false sense of security.
The drugs were hidden in a suitcase with a false bottom. The drugs were hidden in a suitcase with a false bottom.
The man had given a false name and address.
She's so false.
A false laugh.
You played brilliantly. Not really, Ian replied with false modesty.
It's a false economy not to have travel insurance.
He was accused of obtaining money under false pretenses.
One false move and you're dead.
False alarm. False alarm.
Firefighters responded to a false alarm at one of the college dormitories. Firefighters responded to a false alarm at one of the college dormitories.
The patient was okay. It was a false alarm.
False dawn.
False dawn.
The ceasefire turned out to be another false dawn. False friend.
False friend.
Falsehood.
Falsehood.
Saunders is deliberately telling a falsehood.
No one had accused me of falsehood before.
Most people believe in right and wrong, truth and falsehood.
False memory.
False memory.
False positive.
False positive.
50% of the 170 compounds were judged to be carcinogenic, but some of these might be false positives.
Many substances give false positive reactions in allergy skin testing.
False start.
False start.
After several false starts, the concert finally began.
False teeth.
False teeth.
Falsetto.
Falsetto.
Falsies.
Falsies.
Falsify.
Falsify.
The file was altered to falsify the evidence.
The falsification of records.
Falsity.
Falsity.
Falstaffian.
Falstaffian.
Falter.
Falter.
The economy is showing signs of faltering.
My mother's grip upon the household never faltered. My mother's grip upon the household never faltered.
Laurie's voice faltered as she tried to thank him.
I can't, she faltered.
We must not falter in our resolve.
She faltered for a moment.
Faltering.
Faltering.
A baby's first faltering steps.
The faltering Mideast peace talks.
Fame.
Fame.
He claims he is not really interested in fame. Muhammad Ali of boxing fame.
Famed.
Famed.
The famed literary critic Nathan Hall.
The island of Lontar, famed for its nutmeg and cloves. The island of Lontar, famed for its nutmeg and cloves. Familial.
Familial.
Familial obligations.
Familial relationships.
Familiar.
Familiar.
A familiar tune.
The voice on the phone sounded familiar.
The signs of drug addiction are familiar to most doctors.
It was a relief to be back in familiar surroundings.
Beggars on the street are becoming a familiar sight. Beggars on the street are becoming a familiar sight.
This kind of situation was all too familiar to John.
Her face seems vaguely familiar, but I can't quite place her.
Are you familiar with this type of machine? Are you familiar with this type of machine?
I'm not familiar with her poetry.
He's on familiar terms with all the teachers.
I thought he was being a bit familiar with my wife. The novel is written in an easy, familiar style.
Familiarize.
Familiarize.
Familiarity.
Familiarity.
In fact, his familiarity with the Bronx was pretty limited.
I miss the familiarity of home.
He treated her with the easy familiarity of an equal.
Familiarize.
Familiarize.
Employees must familiarize themselves with the health and safety manual.
A one-day familiarization course.
Familiarly.
Familiarly.
Charles, familiarly known as Charlie.
Family.
Family.
Do you know the family next door?
The Webb family still has its farm over there. The Webb family still has its farm over there.
This house isn't big enough for a family of 7. This house isn't big enough for a family of 7.
I'm moving to Detroit because I have some family there. That painting has been in our family for 200 years. Asthma runs in the family. Asthma runs in the family.
Couples with young families wouldn't want to live here.
They're getting married next year and hope to start a family straight away.
The problems of bringing up a family on a very low income. The problems of bringing up a family on a very low income. The cat family includes lions and tigers.
Spanish and Italian are part of the Romance language family.
Family circle.
Family circle.
Family doctor.
Family doctor.
Family friendly.
Family friendly. Family friendly museums. Family man.
Family man.
Family name.
Family name.
Family planning.
Family planning.
A family planning clinic.
Family practice.
Family practice.
Family practitioner.
Family practitioner.
Family room.
Family room.
Family tree.
Family tree.
Family values.
Family values.
The party places great emphasis on family values. Famine.
Famine.
The Great Potato Famine in Ireland.
Widespread famine had triggered a number of violent protests.
1 million people are facing famine.
Famished.
Famished.
What's for supper? I'm famished.
Famous.
Famous.
A famous actor. Many famous people have stayed in the hotel.
The Eiffel Tower is a famous landmark.
France is famous for its wine.
Virginia is famous as the birthplace of several U.S. presidents.
Da Vinci's world-famous portrait of the Mona Lisa. Da Vinci's world-famous portrait of the Mona Lisa.
A nightclub used by the rich and famous.
Famously.
Famously.
The trouble with common sense, as Voltaire famously observed, is that it is not very common. The trouble with common sense, as Voltaire famously observed, is that it is not very common. The trouble with common sense, as Voltaire famously observed, is that it is not very common.
Fan.
Fan.
Groups of football fans began heading towards the ground.
He's a big fan of Elvis Presley.
A ceiling fan.
People in the audience were fanning themselves with their programs.
Her resistance only fanned his desire.
The book will serve to fan the flames of debate. The wind rose, fanning a few sparks in the brush.
Fan the cards out. Then pick one.
Fanatic.
Fanatic.
Fanatics who represent a real danger to democracy.
A religious fanatic.
A health food fanatic.
A fitness fanatic.
A fanatical sportsman.
He was fanatical about tidiness.
Fanaticism.
Fanaticism.
The bombing symbolizes the worst of religious fanaticism. The bombing symbolizes the worst of religious fanaticism.
Fan belt.
Fan belt.
Fanboy.
Fanboy.
Fanciable.
Fanciable.
Fancier.
Fancier.
Fanciful.
Fanciful.
A fanciful story.
The suggestion that there was a conspiracy is not entirely fanciful.
Fanciful decorations.
Fan club.
Fan club. Fancy.
Fancy.
Fancy a quick drink, Emma?
Sorry, but I don't fancy going out tonight.
All the girls fancied him. That bloke on the dance floor really fancies himself.
He fancies himself an artist. She fancies herself as another Madonna. Which team do you fancy this year?
I don't fancy our chances of getting a ticket this late. The Petersons are getting divorced. Fancy that.
Fancy seeing you here.
She fancied she heard a noise downstairs.
Mr. Hill took a real fancy to Clara. Wanting to go to Mexico was just a passing fancy. Because of its high cost, a carpet is not an item that you change as the fancy takes you. Because of its high cost, a carpet is not an item that you change as the fancy takes you. Because of its high cost, a carpet is not an item that you change as the fancy takes you. Did you see anything that took your fancy?
The idea of playing a joke on her tickled his fancy.
Oh, that was just a fancy of his. Oh, that was just a fancy of his.
Harry took me to a fancy restaurant for our anniversary.
Fancy soaps in seashell shapes.
I just want a basic sports coat. Nothing fancy.
I can't do all that fancy stuff on the computer.
Negotiating a deal can take some fancy footwork.
Fancy dress.
Fancy dress.
An invitation to a fancy dress party.
Fancy free. Fancy free.
10 years ago, I was footloose and fancy free.
Fancy man.
Fancy man.
Fancy woman.
Fancy woman.
Fancy work. Fancy work. Fandango. Fandango.
Fanfare.
Fanfare.
The deal was announced with much fanfare.
Fanfic.
Fanfic.
Fang.
Fang.
Fangirl.
Fangirl.
Fanlight.
Fanlight.
Fanny. Fanny.
Fantasia.
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 Fantasize.
Fantasize.
Sometimes she fantasized about buying a boat and sailing around the world.
I used to fantasize that my real parents were famous movie stars.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.
You look fantastic.
It's a fantastic place, really beautiful.
I've passed my driving test. Fantastic.
That's fantastic news. Kids spend fantastic amounts of money on CDs. Kids spend fantastic amounts of money on CDs.
Fantastic schemes for making money.
Fantastic tales of dragons and fairy queens.
Fantastical.
Fantastical.
Fantastical creatures with golden wings and lions' faces.
Fantasy.
Fantasy.
I used to have fantasies about living in Paris with an artist.
Sexual fantasies.
Young children sometimes can't distinguish between fantasy and reality.
He lived in a fantasy world of his own, even as a small boy.
Memories can sometimes be pure fantasy rather than actual recollections.
A surrealist fantasy set in a South American village.
Fantasy football.
Fantasy football.
Fanzine. Fanzine.
Far. FAQ. FAQ. Far.
Far.
Have you driven far?
Since I changed jobs, I have to travel further to get to work.
Let's see who can jump the furthest. The children don't go far from home. She wants to move as far away from here as possible.
They could hear the sound of water not far away. He lives further down the street.
If you want to go further afield, there are bicycles for hire.
Many birds fly further south in the autumn.
The plains stretched for as far as the eye could see.
The lake is about 4 miles away, but we probably won't get that far. How far is it to the station? The man didn't say how far it was to the next town.
They managed to get as far as the Spanish border.
The new system is far better than the old one.
There are a far greater number of women working in television than 20 years ago.
I enjoyed it far more than I expected.
That's far too much to pay.
It would take me far too long to explain.
He bought it for a price that was far beyond its real value. He bought it for a price that was far beyond its real value.
The teacher said that her writing skills were far below average.
We've kept the original features of the house as far as possible. We've kept the original features of the house as far as possible.
How far do those old, outdated laws affect today's legislation? How far do those old, outdated laws affect today's legislation? How far do those old, outdated laws affect today's legislation?
His style was far removed from that of Picasso.
I guessed it would cost $100, and it was $110, so I was not far out.
He started to explain, but he didn't get far before Mary interrupted him.
They had got as far as painting the kitchen.
Many people felt that the new law did not go far enough.
We talked far into the night.
They want to plan much further ahead than the next few years.
The first petrol-driven car was produced as far back as 1883.
One day she will go too far.
Some people thought he had gone too far in his criticism of the police.
The government went so far as to try to arrest opposition leaders.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that we agreed on the subject. I wouldn't go so far as to say that we agreed on the subject.
So far we have not had to borrow any money.
They're delighted with the replies they've received from the public thus far. They're delighted with the replies they've received from the public thus far. They're delighted with the replies they've received from the public thus far.
We've reached the semi-finals. So far, so good.
Conditions are still far from ideal.
Far from helping the situation, you've just made it worse.
Are you bored? Far from it. I could listen all night.
Local people aren't objecting. Far from it.
His fame spread far and wide.
People came from far and wide to see the concert.
Watching sport was by far the most popular activity on Saturday afternoons.
Spring is far and away the best time to visit the islands.
He was the best student in his year, and everyone was sure he would go far.
As far as I'm concerned, she can come home whenever she likes.
As far as money's concerned, there shouldn't be a problem. There weren't any buildings there at all, as far as I can remember. There weren't any buildings there at all, as far as I can remember.
As far as I can see, there's nothing else to discuss.
Far be it from me to teach you your job, but don't you think you should have been more careful? Far be it from me to teach you your job, but don't you think you should have been more careful?
His theories are fine as far as they go. His theories are fine as far as they go.
My salary doesn't go very far these days.
The coffee won't go far if everyone wants a cup.
The research suggests that the drug will be successful, insofar as one can draw conclusions from such a small sample size.
We can walk to my house from here. It isn't far.
You could see the mountains in the far distance.
They crossed the bridge and walked along the far side of the stream.
There was a piano in the far corner of the room.
It will become windy in the far north and west. The candidate for the far right got 10% of the vote. The candidate for the far right got 10% of the vote.
The company lost £3 million, which is a far cry from last year's £60 million profit. The company lost £3 million, which is a far cry from last year's £60 million profit.
An amendment to the Constitution would be regarded as a step too far. An amendment to the Constitution would be regarded as a step too far.
Far away.
Far away.
She dreamed of flying away to exotic faraway places.
Faraway noises.
His eyes had a distant, faraway look, like a sailor staring out to sea. His eyes had a distant, faraway look, like a sailor staring out to sea.